Adrian Voss looked straight into his wife's eyes and said, without a trace of hesitation, that she needed to leave the house forever, that she no longer belonged there. He said it in the same tone he used to close a business deal, flat and final, as though her entire life could be settled with one signature and a locked door. He was certain that within a few hours his lawyer would have every document signed, and that the entire corporation they had built together would belong to him alone. What Adrian did not know was that the moment Zaria Kingston walked upstairs to pack a single suitcase, she made one phone call, calm and unhurried, as if she had rehearsed it 1,000 times in her mind. 20 minutes later, the man buying her shares had already wired several $billion into an escrow account, and the paperwork was already moving faster than Adrian's own lawyers could dream of moving. By the time the lawyer knocked on the front door that evening, briefcase in hand and confidence written across her face, it was Adrian who had lost everything, and he would not fully understand the scale of that loss for several more hours. He would spend that evening believing himself victorious, pouring a glass of expensive wine and imagining the headlines that would soon carry his name alone, never once suspecting that the ground had already shifted beneath the very floor he stood on. The Central Park townhouse glowed with the pale gold light of late autumn, the kind of light that made the whole city look softer and gentler than it actually was that day. Adrian had called the meeting himself, choosing the living room because it had always been the room where he felt most powerful, the room with the tall windows and the sweeping view he liked to remind guests had cost more than most homes in the entire country. He stood near the marble fireplace when he told Zaria that their marriage was over, that the house was legally his alone, and that 2 security guards were already waiting outside the front gate in case she needed help understanding that fact clearly. He said it the way a man says something he has rehearsed in a mirror many times, proud of his own coldness, mistaking that coldness for strength and mistaking her silence for weakness. Behind him, on the mantel, sat a photograph from the early years, the two of them exhausted and smiling outside their very first rented office, a photograph he did not seem to notice at all in that moment. Outside, the light was already fading into that particular shade of blue that autumn evenings in the city seem to specialize in, the kind of hour when the windows of every building across the park begin lighting up one by one like a slow chain reaction. Adrian had chosen this hour deliberately, believing there was something theatrical about ending a marriage just as the sky darkened, something that suited the sense of finality he wanted to project. He had even changed his shirt before the meeting, a small and telling detail that revealed how much thought he had actually put into staging this particular moment. None of it registered with Zaria the way he expected it to, because she had spent years learning to separate performance from substance, and she recognized immediately which one she was looking at. Zaria did not argue, and she did not raise her voice. Standing perfectly still in the middle of the room, he clearly believed already belonged only to him. She did not cry, and she certainly did not beg him to reconsider, because begging had never once solved a single problem in her entire life, not in business and not in love. She simply looked at him for a long, unhurried moment, studying his face the way she used to study a flawed business proposal, searching quietly for the crack that would eventually bring the whole structure down around him. Then she asked him one question, quiet and steady, the kind of question that should have made any intelligent man pause and reconsider everything he thought he understood. She asked whether he was absolutely certain this was his final decision, whether there was no version of tomorrow where he might regret the words currently leaving his mouth, and Adrian, smiling the smile of a man who believed he had already won the entire war, said that he was completely certain that nothing she could say or do would ever change his mind. That single sentence would turn out to be the most expensive mistake of his entire life, though he had no way of knowing that yet as he stood there, satisfied, waiting for her to break down. Zaria nodded once, turned without another word, and walked upstairs to pack exactly one suitcase, taking nothing that mattered sentimentally to Adrian, and nothing that would give him the satisfaction of watching her fight over trivial possessions. She paused at the top of the staircase, looked down at the wide entryway of the house she had spent 15 years helping to build from nothing, and felt something settle deep inside her that was not sadness, but a strange and steady clarity. Before she reached the front door, before the security guards outside had even shifted their weight from one foot to the other, she had already dialed a number she had saved for exactly this moment, a number she had never once used aloud, though she had carried it quietly in her contacts for 3 long years. The man on the other end answered on the second ring, almost as if he had been sitting by the phone the entire time, waiting for a call he somehow already knew was coming. 15 years earlier, in a cramped apartment in Brooklyn with water-stained ceilings and a radiator that never quite worked properly no matter how many times the landlord promised to fix it, Zaria had written the very first business plan for what would eventually become Kingston Voss Dynamics. She had sold her own small apartment to raise the initial capital, moving into a smaller rental unit so that every spare dollar could go directly toward lab equipment, legal filings, and the endless small expenses that came with building something from absolutely nothing. Adrian, at the time, had no job and no clear prospects, having just been let go from a mid-level position at a pharmaceutical company that never quite appreciated his ambition or his ideas. It was Zaria's mind that first shaped the original biotechnology concept. Zaria's careful research that identified the gap in the market, Zaria's tireless networking that brought in the very first round of skeptical investors, and Zaria's persistence that eventually secured the company's very first paying client after months of closed doors. In those early days, there had been no assistants to screen their calls and no glass conference rooms to negotiate inside. Only 2 folding chairs, a second-hand printer that jammed constantly, and a shared determination that refused to bend no matter how many banks turned them away. Zaria remembered pitching to investors who barely looked up from their phones, remembered the particular sting of being asked whether her husband might be a more suitable spokesperson for the technology she herself had designed. She had swallowed that insult more times than she cared to count, telling herself that results would eventually speak louder than anyone's assumptions. And in time, they finally did. Adrian, to his credit in those days, had worked just as hard beside her, staying up through countless nights refining pitch decks and rehearsing answers to questions investors were likely to ask, and for a long while it genuinely felt like the two of them were building something no one could ever pull apart. For the first 3 years, the two of them worked as true and equal partners, sharing credit generously, sharing exhaustion honestly, and sharing the quiet, private joy of watching something they had built from nothing begin to breathe entirely on its own. But success has a way of quietly rearranging people, reshaping their priorities in ways they themselves barely notice. And as the company grew larger and more visible, Adrian began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways that only someone as observant as Zaria would have caught early. He started attending press events alone, explaining afterward that Zaria hated cameras anyway, which was technically true, though it was also true that he never once suggested she join him or offered to share the spotlight he seemed to enjoy more and more each time. He became the public face of the company, the confident chief executive, whose name appeared in glossy headlines and industry panels, while Zaria quietly moved into a strategic advisory role, a title that sounded considerably smaller on paper than it actually was in practice. Colleagues who had worked alongside her for years noticed the shift too, though few said anything directly, assuming perhaps that she had simply chosen to step back by her own preference rather than being gradually pushed aside by circumstance. Zaria herself rarely spoke of it, even to close friends, carrying the quiet frustration privately, rather than airing it in a way that might destabilize the company she had sacrificed so much to build. It was not that she lacked the words to explain what was happening to her. It was that she understood, better than most, the cost of fighting a battle before the odds had shifted fully in her favor. What almost no one in that boardroom fully understood, what Adrian himself had conveniently forgotten somewhere along the way, was that Zaria had never released her original ownership stake in the company. She had simply stopped mentioning it in public, allowing everyone around her, including her own husband, to quietly assume that her silence meant surrender or indifference toward the numbers she once cared about deeply. In truth, she still held enough shares to shift the entire balance of power within the company at a moment's notice, a fact she had kept folded carefully inside herself, the way a chess player keeps a queen in reserve, long after the opponent has completely forgotten that piece still exists on the board. As she walked out of the house that evening, suitcase in hand and expression unreadable, that carefully guarded reserve was about to move for the very first time. The man who answered her call that evening was named Damien Holt, a widely respected investor, known throughout the financial world for his patience, his discretion, and his sharp instinct for undervalued assets that others overlooked entirely. For years, Damien had quietly pursued Zaria's shares, sending careful, respectful offers through trusted intermediaries, always met politely, and always met with a firm and unwavering refusal. He never pushed too hard, understanding somehow, almost instinctively, that Zaria was waiting for something specific, though he could never have guessed exactly what that something was or when it would finally arrive. Damien had built his own fortune quietly, avoiding the flashy acquisitions that made headlines in favor of careful, well-researched positions in companies whose true value the broader market had not yet recognized. Colleagues sometimes joked that he collected patience the way other investors collected trophies, content to wait years for the right moment rather than force an outcome before its time. That same patience was precisely why Zaria had chosen him over the dozen other suitors who had approached her with louder offers and far less discretion over the years. When his phone rang that evening, and he saw her name appear on the screen, he did not ask why she was calling him at that particular hour. He simply asked, in a calm and almost amused voice, whether she had finally decided to sell, as though the question itself had been sitting patiently on his tongue for 3 long years. Zaria's answer was short, and it was completely final, without a single trace of hesitation in her voice. She told him she wanted to sell everything, not in careful pieces, not in gradual tranches designed to soften the impact on the market or on Adrian's ego, but the entire stake, all at once, immediately, and without delay. Damien, who had spent years quietly imagining this exact conversation playing out in his mind, did not hesitate for even a single second before responding. He told her he would be at her lawyer's office within the hour, and true to his word, he arrived precisely 58 minutes later, dressed as though he had planned this exact meeting for months rather than mere minutes. The negotiation that followed lasted only 13 minutes, a fact that would later become something of a quiet legend among the lawyers who happened to witness it firsthand. Damien did not haggle over price the way most investors instinctively would, because he already understood, better than almost anyone else in the entire industry, exactly what Zaria's shares were truly worth. Zaria laid out her conditions with the same precision she once used when designing a laboratory protocol, refusing to sell any portion piecemeal, insisting on full and immediate payment, and demanding absolute confidentiality until the entire transaction had fully closed. Damien agreed to every term without pushing back even slightly, understanding clearly that speed and discretion mattered far more to her in that particular moment than a slightly better price ever could. The conference room where the deal was finalized belonged to a law firm on the 52nd floor, chosen specifically because its senior partner owed Zaria a favor from years earlier and could be trusted to move quickly without asking unnecessary questions. Assistants were called in from home, coffee was brewed by the pot rather than the cup, and phones rang steadily as compliance officers verified account numbers late into the evening. Damien sat quietly through most of it, occasionally checking messages on his phone, projecting the calm patience of a man who understood that rushing the paperwork now would only create problems later. Zaria, for her part, read every single page placed in front of her with the same careful attention she had once given to laboratory data, refusing to sign anything until she had confirmed it said exactly what she intended it to say. The lawyers on both sides worked with unusual urgency that evening, verifying signatures, confirming wire instructions, and finalizing documents that would normally take weeks to properly complete under ordinary circumstances. Within a matter of hours, the transfer was fully locked, the funds moved securely into an escrow account, and ownership of Zaria's shares officially changed hands for the first time in 15 years. At the very same moment, across town, a woman named Vivienne Cross was climbing into a car, a leather folder of divorce papers resting neatly on the seat beside her, completely unaware that the ground beneath her client's feet had already shifted without warning. Vivienne had served as Adrian's legal director for 6 years, a sharp and capable attorney who genuinely believed this particular case, would be one of the simplest and cleanest of her entire career. She had reviewed the marriage records, the property deeds, and the corporate filings thoroughly, and everything on paper suggested a clean, one-sided victory awaiting her client without much resistance. She had no reason to imagine that anything unusual was happening behind the scenes, no reason to suspect that the woman she was about to hand divorce papers to had, only hours earlier, quietly become one of the wealthiest private shareholders in the entire biotechnology sector. She simply drove toward the townhouse with the calm, practiced confidence of someone who believed the outcome of the evening had already been decided in advance. When Vivienne arrived at the house, Adrian greeted her with the easy, satisfied grin of a man expecting applause for a battle he assumed he had already won. He led her into the same living room where he had confronted Zarya hours earlier, and together they laid out the papers carefully on the long glass table, papers demanding a full division of assets, the immediate revocation of Zarya's voting rights, and the complete cancellation of her shareholder status within the company. Adrian leaned back comfortably in his chair as Vivienne spoke through the details, savoring every single word, imagining the exact moment his wife would finally be forced to accept defeat in cold, official writing. He truly believed, in that quiet and self-satisfied instant, that he was standing at the very peak of his personal and professional power. Zarya listened to the entire presentation without interrupting even once, her expression calm and almost gentle, the expression of someone watching a storm that had already fully spent itself elsewhere. When Vivienne finally finished speaking, Zarya reached into her bag and placed a different folder on the table, one that neither Adrian nor Vivienne had been expecting to see that evening. Inside was a fully notarized share transfer agreement, complete, executed, and already filed properly with the appropriate regulatory bodies earlier that same day. Vivienne's face lost its color almost instantly as she scanned the pages, her eyes moving faster and faster as the full weight of the situation slowly became clear to her. Vivienne flipped back to the first page of the agreement, then to the last, as though repetition alone might change what the document actually said. She had built her entire reputation on thoroughness, on knowing every detail of a case before walking into a room, and the fact that something this significant had happened entirely outside her awareness left her visibly rattled for the first time in years. She glanced up at Adrian, searching his face for some sign that he already knew, some indication that this was simply a formality he had forgotten to mention to her earlier that day. What she found instead was pure confusion, the unmistakable look of a man who had walked confidently into a room only to discover the floor had already been removed from beneath him. Adrian rose from his chair so quickly that it scraped loudly against the polished hardwood floor, his voice cracking slightly as he insisted that what she was showing him was simply not possible under any circumstances. Zarya did not raise her voice, and she did not allow even a flicker of satisfaction to cross her calm, composed face, despite everything she now held in her hands. She answered him with only 2 words, spoken so softly that Vivienne had to lean in slightly just to hear them clearly across the table. She said that it was, in fact, entirely possible, and that it had already happened hours earlier while he was still celebrating his own imagined victory. Before Adrian could respond with anything more than confused disbelief, his phone began ringing loudly in his pocket, the caller identification showing the name of the chairman of the company's board of directors. The chairman's voice was tight and unmistakably urgent, informing Adrian that an emergency board meeting had been called for the following morning, and that his personal presence was strictly mandatory. Adrian stared across the glass table at Zarya, the divorce papers now completely forgotten between them, suddenly understanding that something far larger than his marriage had just quietly come undone without his knowledge. The boardroom the next morning felt noticeably colder than usual, its familiar, polished warmth replaced entirely by a tension that seemed to seep out of the very walls surrounding them. Damien Holt sat near the head of the long table now, no longer simply an outside investor, but a major shareholder with a formal seat at the table for the very first time in his career. Elias Monroe, the elder statesman of the company's earliest investors, and the very man who had once personally mentored Zarya through her most difficult early years in business, sat quietly beside him, his expression completely unreadable to everyone else present. Adrian tried to command the room the way he always had in the past, speaking with practiced confidence about growth targets and future strategy, but something in the atmosphere of the room had already shifted firmly against him. The votes that followed did not fall the way Adrian had confidently expected, and one by one, the other investors began raising pointed questions he had never before been forced to answer directly. They asked pointedly about a string of strategic missteps from the past 2 years, about steadily declining quarterly revenue figures, and about spending patterns that seemed to have no clear or reasonable justification behind them. Zarya said very little during the meeting itself, choosing instead to quietly distribute a set of financial reports she had personally compiled. Reports built entirely on verified numbers, rather than carefully worded assumptions or optimistic projections. Each page had been prepared weeks in advance, long before Adrian ever spoke the words that ended their marriage, evidence that she had been quietly documenting the company's true condition long before she ever intended to use it publicly. The precision of the report spoke for itself, requiring no dramatic presentation or persuasive speech to make its point land clearly with everyone at the table. For the first time in many years, Adrian watched the room's undivided attention shift completely away from him and directly toward his wife, and the realization landed on him like a genuine physical weight in his chest. Other members of the board, people who had spent years quietly deferring to Adrian's confident presentations without asking many pointed questions, suddenly found themselves comparing notes in hushed voices during the short recess. A director named Patricia Hale, who had sat on the board since the company's initial public offering, admitted openly that she had always found Adrian's growth projections a little too optimistic to fully trust. Another director recalled a warning Zarya had raised nearly 2 years earlier about overextending into markets. The company was not yet prepared to enter, a warning that had been politely acknowledged and then completely ignored. By the time everyone returned to their seats, the mood in the room had shifted from cautious uncertainty into something closer to quiet consensus, and Adrian could feel that shift settling over him like a change in weather. By the time the meeting reached its final agenda item, someone at the table formally proposed a vote to seriously consider replacing the chief executive officer entirely and immediately. Adrian's jaw tightened noticeably as the words were spoken aloud for everyone to hear, and he glanced quickly toward Vivian, hoping for some kind of reassurance or support, but she offered him none in return. The meeting adjourned without reaching a final decision that morning, though everyone seated around the table understood clearly that the question had already, in every meaningful sense, been answered without needing further discussion. In the days that followed, an independent auditing team was brought in at Damien's firm insistence, tasked with reviewing every significant expenditure the company had made over the previous several years in careful detail. What they uncovered painted a deeply troubling picture, one filled with unnecessary luxuries and consistently questionable judgment on Adrian's part. There were repeated charges for a private jet used far more often for personal travel than for any legitimate business purpose, enormous entertainment budgets tied to client meetings that never once resulted in signed contracts, and a series of costly ventures that had collapsed almost immediately after their poorly planned launches. Zarya had objected to several of these exact decisions years earlier, sending careful memos that had quietly disappeared into folders. No one ever bothered to reopen. Memos Adrian had dismissed at the time as unnecessary caution from someone who no longer understood risk. The auditor's preliminary summary, delivered in a thick binder that landed heavily on the boardroom table, detailed nearly $40 million in expenditures over 3 years that could not be clearly tied to any measurable business outcome. There was a renovation of the executive suite that had cost far more than the original estimate, a sponsorship deal with a sports franchise that generated no measurable increase in brand recognition, and consulting fees paid to firms that appeared to have produced no actual reports in return. Several of the transactions had been personally approved by Adrian without requiring a second signature, a policy he himself had quietly pushed through the finance committee years earlier under the guise of operational efficiency. When the numbers were read aloud in the boardroom, a heavy silence followed, the kind of silence that comes when people finally see, in black and white, what they had previously chosen not to notice. Damien formally requested a full and independent investigation into the company's finances, a request the board approved almost immediately, without significant resistance from anyone present. Vivienne, sitting through hours of testimony and detailed financial disclosure, slowly began to understand that she had, without ever fully realizing it, positioned herself firmly on the wrong side of a battle that was already effectively lost. Adrian's composure began to crack noticeably under the mounting pressure surrounding him, and he grew increasingly agitated during meetings, lashing out sharply at auditors, at board members, and eventually, even at Vivienne herself, blaming everyone around him except the one person truly responsible for the mess. Trust, once broken so publicly and so thoroughly, proved almost impossible to rebuild in any meaningful way, and Adrian could feel it slipping steadily through his fingers with every passing day that went by. It was during one particularly tense session that Elias Monroe reached quietly into his worn leather briefcase and withdrew a sealed envelope, one that appeared to have been carefully stored away for a very long time. The room fell completely silent as he broke the seal slowly, and an unmistakable stillness settled heavily over everyone present. The kind of stillness that only comes when people sense something deeply significant is about to happen. Elias unfolded the letter with steady hands, cleared his throat quietly, and began to read it aloud to the entire assembled board without any dramatic flourish. The letter had been written 7 years earlier, signed personally by Adrian himself during an early and uncertain period for the young company's finances. In it, Adrian had openly acknowledged, in his own clear handwriting, that without Zaria's original vision and tireless early effort, the company would never have existed in the first place at all. He had written plainly that the founding technology, the very concept that had eventually attracted hundreds of millions of dollars in outside investment, belonged entirely to her mind and her fierce early determination. At the time, the letter had been intended only as a private reassurance to a handful of nervous early investors, a simple way of proving the company's foundation was genuinely solid, but its existence had long since faded from Adrian's own memory over the passing years. Elias's voice remained steady as he read, though anyone who knew him well could hear the quiet weight behind each sentence, the sense that he had carried this letter for years, hoping he would never actually need to use it. He had kept it not out of malice, but out of a careful investor's instinct for preserving evidence, tucking it away in a personal safe long before anyone imagined it might one day matter this much. As he finished reading and lowered the pages, he looked directly at Adrian rather than at Zaria, his expression more disappointed than triumphant, the look of a mentor watching a promising protégé fail a test he had once believed the young man capable of passing. The room absorbed the words slowly, investors glancing at one another as the full implications settled in, understanding now that everything they had been told about the company's leadership over the years had been, at best, incomplete. The investors seated around the room sat in stunned, complete silence, as the true origin of the company was laid bare in Adrian's own words, undeniable now and entirely irreversible. Adrian sat frozen in his chair, his face pale, unable to offer even a single explanation that might soften the moment or the damage it had already caused. Whatever fragile authority he had managed to hold onto through the previous difficult days evaporated completely and permanently in that single instant. Shortly afterward, Damien turned toward Zaria and, in front of the entire assembled board, formally proposed that she return to the company as its new chairperson. Zaria did not respond with anger or with any visible sense of triumph, and she made no attempt whatsoever to humiliate Adrian in front of the people who had once trusted him so completely and so publicly. She simply stated, in a calm and carefully measured tone, that a business was never meant to be a stage for anyone's personal pride or wounded ego. She told the board plainly that if she agreed to return to her former role, it would only be under specific and non-negotiable conditions, conditions designed to protect the company's future rather than simply to settle old personal scores. She insisted firmly on a complete restructuring of internal governance, full financial transparency at every single level of the organization, and an absolute end to any special privileges granted to executives based purely on personal relationships rather than genuine merit. The board voted unanimously in her favor that same afternoon, without hesitation and without a single dissenting voice raised anywhere in the room. As the meeting ended and people slowly began gathering their belongings to leave, Adrian quietly approached Zarya and asked if they could speak privately for just a few minutes before she left the building. Something in his voice, stripped now of all its earlier arrogance and false confidence, made her agree, and the two of them stepped together into a small, quiet side office away from the others. Alone in that room, Adrian finally allowed the mask to fall away completely, and for the first time in many years, he spoke to her without performance and without any careful pretense. He admitted quietly that he had never truly believed she would actually leave, convinced somewhere deep down that her loyalty and patience were essentially limitless, a resource he could draw from forever without any real consequence. He confessed that he had assumed, however unfairly and however selfishly, that she would always eventually forgive him, no matter what he did or said, that her love for what they had built together would outweigh any wound he ever caused her. He asked, quietly now, and without his usual confidence, whether there was any possibility left for a second chance between them. He reminded her, almost desperately, of the nights they had spent together in that cramped Brooklyn apartment, of the promises they had made to each other before either of them had a single dollar to their name. He told her that whatever mistakes he had made in recent years, the foundation of what they once had together still meant something to him, that he was not simply asking for the company back. Zarya listened without interrupting, letting him finish completely, because she understood that this was likely the last honest conversation the two of them would ever share. When he finally fell silent, waiting for her response with something close to genuine fear in his eyes, she took a slow breath before speaking. Zarya studied him for a long, quiet moment before finally answering, her voice steady and completely free of any lingering bitterness. She told him plainly that he had lost the company before he had ever truly lost their marriage, and that the two losses, though deeply connected, were not exactly the same wound in her heart. There was no real anger left in her words by that point, only a clear and settled truth that neither of them could ever undo now. She signed the final divorce papers that same afternoon, without further negotiation, without conflict, and without shedding a single tear in front of him. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, and no bitter parting words exchanged between them in that final quiet moment together. Zarya simply gathered the signed documents carefully, thanked the lawyers present for their professionalism and their time, and walked calmly out of the building into the crisp autumn air waiting outside. The ending, when it finally came, felt less like a battle concluding in victory and more like a long, complicated chapter quietly closing itself on its own terms. The following morning, the story broke across every major financial publication in the country, each one covering it from a slightly different angle and perspective. Reporters praised Zarya, not simply because she had walked away with an enormous personal fortune, though the sheer scale of the transaction certainly drew plenty of attention from financial columnists. What genuinely captured public imagination was the deeper truth beneath the numbers themselves, the undeniable proof that a marriage certificate had never once determined who had actually built something of lasting value from nothing. A chief executive title, no matter how impressive it looked, printed neatly on a business card, had never truly been the real source of power within that company. Not really, and not honestly. The real foundation, the one that actually mattered in the end, had always belonged quietly to the person who created it from nothing in the very first place, long before anyone else believed it was possible. Financial analysts who had once written glowing profiles of Adrian's leadership style quietly revised their assessments, some publishing follow-up pieces examining how easily a founder's contribution could be erased from public memory through nothing more than persistent self-promotion. A prominent business magazine ran a lengthy feature on Zarya within the month, tracing her journey from that water-stained Brooklyn apartment to the boardroom where she reclaimed everything she had originally built. The piece noted, with some admiration, that she had never once sought media attention during the years she spent quietly holding onto her shares, choosing patience over publicity even when publicity might have served her interests. Other founders, particularly women who had watched their own contributions, minimized within partnerships and companies they helped create, began citing her story as a quiet lesson in the value of preparation over confrontation. In the months that followed, the company's structure changed dramatically and permanently in ways few had expected so quickly. Adrian resigned from his position entirely, stepping away completely from the industry that had once defined every single part of his public identity, choosing instead a far quieter and far less visible life away from the spotlight. Vivienne, deeply affected by everything she had personally witnessed during those turbulent weeks, eventually left corporate litigation altogether and became a consultant specializing in ethical governance for growing companies navigating similar challenges. She later admitted, during a small industry panel discussion, that the case had permanently changed how she evaluated her clients before agreeing to represent them, teaching her to look far more carefully at the full history behind a company, rather than accepting the version presented to her in a single confident meeting. It was a lesson she said she wished she had learned earlier in her career, though she was grateful it had arrived before it cost her everything she had worked to build. Damien Holt took on a formal role as a strategic partner within the newly reorganized company, bringing both his considerable capital and his years of experience to help guide its next promising chapter forward. Elias Monroe, having finally watched the company return to the founding principles he had championed since its earliest and most uncertain days, chose to retire peacefully soon afterward, satisfied that it was once again resting in capable and trustworthy hands. At his farewell gathering, held in a modest room rather than the grand ballroom Adrian would once have insisted upon, Elias spoke briefly about the importance of remembering who actually does the building, long after the applause fades and the headlines move on to someone else. He raised his glass toward Zarya specifically, telling the room quietly that he had never once doubted her, even during the years when her name rarely appeared in the press coverage surrounding the company she had created. It was, several attendees later remarked, the most honest toast anyone had given in that boardroom in a very long time. Zarya stood alone one evening in her new office on an upper floor of a gleaming Manhattan tower, watching the last golden light of day settle slowly over the skyline she had once only dared to dream about reaching. She was no longer the woman who had been coldly ordered to leave her own home, stripped of dignity by a man who had mistaken control for genuine love. She had become something far more enduring instead, a woman who had reclaimed not just her company, but her entire sense of self, through nothing more than quiet patience, careful preparation, and decisions made at precisely the right moment in time. In that peaceful stillness, she felt no lingering need for revenge, no residual desire to prove anything further to anyone else watching from the outside. She thought back, in that quiet moment, to the version of herself who had once sat in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, convinced that no one would ever take her seriously, and she found herself grateful, in a strange way, for every closed door that had forced her to grow sharper and more patient than she otherwise might have become. The city below her stretched out in every direction, indifferent and glittering, the same city that had once seemed impossibly large and unreachable to a young woman, with nothing but an idea and a stubborn refusal to quit. Now it simply looked like home, not because she owned more of it than before, but because she finally understood, fully and completely, that she had never actually needed anyone's permission to belong there. Somewhere out past the glass, past the endless rows of lit windows and the slow crawl of traffic far below, a new chapter was already quietly beginning, one she intended to write entirely on her own terms this time. People can take away a house, a title, or even a marriage, stripping someone of the outward symbols that once seemed to define their entire life. But no one can ever truly take away the real value of the person who built something genuine in the first place. Not if that person remains calm enough, patient enough, and wise enough to eventually turn betrayal into an unshakable advantage. Zarya Kingston had learned that essential lesson long before Adrian ever spoke those cold, dismissive words to her in their living room that autumn evening, and it was that quiet, patient knowledge, carried silently within her for years, that had ultimately made all the difference when it finally mattered most.